met with a different group of people, why Chris left the way he did. I really watered down those answers for a long time.
While traversing a deep forest in Northern California in 2008, a young man stopped to arrange his tent for the evening. He came onto a tiny clearing after veering a few hundred feet off the main path into the trees. He erected his tent, then ascended inside and turned in for sleep. A few hours later, he woke up and heard something outside his tent. He was blind as his tent lacked windows and the outside was totally dark. Laying there, he listened attentively, attempting to decipher what was happening. At that, he heard it once more. This is the narrative of a teenage hiker still unidentified. Let therefore we explore the narrative. Released in 2007, the film Into the Wild went straight to become an instant classic. It drew on the actual account of a young guy called Christopher McCandless. Christopher selected a different road even though he graduated with honors and had an excellent job offer in 1990. Seeking actual freedom, he sold all he had and paid for and traveled to Alaska to live off-grid by himself. Living for 113 days in the bush, he finally came upon an old rusting bus and sadly perished from malnutrition. Although his narrative is depressing, the film focused on his search of independence and adventurous attitude. Viewers left at the end motivated to take chances and search adventure, not depressed. Matt Higgins, an Oregon 18-year-old, was one individual profoundly moved by Christopher's account. Matt had no notion what to do going to graduate from high school, but after seeing Into the Wild, he considered another path, traveling into the bush exactly as Christopher did, though temporarily. Seeing the concept as a respite from reality where he could find himself before deciding what to do next, Matt enjoyed it. He thus devised a strategy. Following his graduation in 2007, he would hike alone the California portion of the Pacific Crest Trail during the spring of 2008. Starting at the Mexican border and running north to Oregon, Matt intended to trek a 1,700-mile segment. The path wound via mountains, deserts, and locations with deadly animals. Some of the trail was quite isolated, hence, if something went wrong, hikers would be totally on their own. Matt wasn't new to the outdoors, but this was not a climb for beginners. From safe, well-marked paths to more perilous regions with cougars, bears, and cliffs, he has trekked and tented all around Oregon and the western U.S. Matt felt sure he was ready for this trip. He was right in many respects, but on the route, something was going to happen that even his experience couldn't equip him for. Matt followed his strategy in 2008 after finishing high school in 2007. He packed, drove to the airport, and flew to Southern California that spring. He landed and then headed down to the Mexican border, where he began his trip on the Pacific Crest Trail northward. Matt walked as far as he could each day for the first several weeks. He had put up his campsite right next to the trail when it grew too dark or when he was too exhausted. Following a hurried lunch, he would burrow into his tent and sleep, only to get up early the following morning and repeat everything. During this period, his primary challenges were managing tiredness, minor dehydration, and nearly stepping on a rattlesnake. Apart from that, for him the climb had been somewhat seamless. Things changed, though, when he arrived to Lassen National Woodland, a deep woodland in Northern California, roughly 150 miles from Oregon. Matt was strolling on a meandering dirt path, surrounded by trees so close together it felt like walls growing up around him shortly after arriving in Lassen. Though dark and quiet, the air was calm with insects buzzing and birds tweeting. Matt was savoring the silence and was slow. The trail then sharply turned to the right, and what he saw froze him in his tracks. Two middle-aged adults, a guy and a woman, were seated on a large boulder about 20 feet distant. Looking filthy and disheveled, they were both wearing all white. Both of them were squarely staring at Matt. The male had a large, messy beard. Embarrassed, Matt turned immediately downward and started moving toward them. He waved and attempted a smile as he approached, saying, "Hi," but they didn't reply. They merely looked at him without expressing any feeling or a word. Knowing they were still observing him, Matt felt nervous after passing them. Matt resisted the need to turn around as he continued forward, since their strong eyes made him uneasy. Given that it was rare to see other hikers on the Pacific Crest Trail, particularly after days without seeing anyone, it felt strange that they didn't acknowledge him. "Why didn't they at least wave or say something?" he said. Still, Matt dismissed it, telling himself, "Maybe they didn't understand me or had their own issues. Who knows? It's not my problem." He went on and never turned back at the two white people. Matt was still meandering across the deep forest later that day when the sun sank. One could find it difficult to see as the light was waning. He began searching for somewhere to camp, but given the proximity of the trees to the track, there was nowhere to set up without obstructing the way. Not wanting to be in the path, Matt searched for a little clearing to set up his tent after walking some 300 feet into the woods. Once his tent was ready, he prepared some supper, stashed his leftovers in a waterproof bag, and hanged it from a tree branch to guard against bears. By the time he crawled into his tent, zipped it, and nestled into his sleeping bag to nod off, it was dark. Matt got up early the following morning exactly as the sun was beginning to rise. Still rather dark, there was some faint illumination. Unzipped his tent, he peered outside and saw right once that his food bag, which he had hanged from a tree, vanished. Thinking perhaps it dropped to the ground, Matt emerged from his tent but could not find it. The bag has vanished. I thought to myself, maybe a bear came into the campsite, found the food, and ran off with it. I didn't hear anything last night. Seeking bear prints to support his theory, Matt headed toward the tree where the food had been. But he looked about and saw no bear prints. Rather, he discovered two sets of human boot prints he did not own. He knew these marks weren't only close to the tree where his food was before he could interpret that. They were everywhere, around his tent, all over his campsite. How did this happen? I went to bed when it was dark, and I woke up just as the sun was rising. These people walked all over my campsite, cut down my food, and somehow did it silently, without waking me. How is that even possible? Matt asked. Following these ideas, Matt came to see that the only reason the two white-dressed individuals he observed had followed him. They have to have waited for him to nod off, and then crept into his campground to pilfer his food. Thinking about it, he started to worry whether they were still close by observing him. He turned fast, nearly expecting to see them behind a tree, but he found no one. Still, he felt as though he was being observation. Matt felt nervous, packed his campsite fast, and began walking toward the trail. He moved faster and faster. "They're going to leap out from behind a tree or grab me from behind," he kept thinking. When he at last arrived at the route, he peered up and down but saw nobody. He inhaled deeply, cool-headed, and began northward walking. For hours Matt strolled, looking over his shoulder sometimes in search of the white guy and woman. Still, they never showed up. The sun was high in the sky as the thick woodland opened out to a large, wide field eventually. He relaxed as he moved over the broad space. The sunlight and the open space calmed his anxiety. Despite the eerie meeting, Matt persuaded himself that perhaps those individuals were simply hungry and more in need of the food than he was. "Let them have it," he said. "It is not worth worrying about." Matt promised himself he wouldn't run across the white folks once more. Nevertheless, he was mistaken. He kept walking the Lassen forest for the next 3 days without spotting them, and nothing was stolen. They looked to have grabbed what they wanted and then moved on. On the 4th day, though, things grew odd once more. Matt had to veer off the track that evening in search of a tent clearing in a heavily forested region. He set up his tent, strolled a few hundred feet off the trail, and encircled his encampment with sticks. This was a precaution he began following the food incident. The theory was that an animal or someone approaching his campfire would tread on the sticks and awaken him. Matt ate a short dinner, put his stuff away, and crawled into his tent for the evening when everything was set up. A few hours later, Matt woke up abruptly. He opened his eyes, however his tent was totally dark. He couldn't see anything even with his eyes wide. Windows were absent, and outside was pitch black. Lying in complete darkness, he listened attentively, not knowing why he had woke up. Maybe something frightened him, or perhaps it was just random. He listened and then heard a stick shatter outside his tent. His heart accelerated. He sensed something. An animal or a person was just a few feet away. He silently slipped his arm from his sleeping sack and groped for his hunting knife. He heard more footfall as he grabbed the doorknob. Whatever it was had not stopped and seemed unconcerned about the noise it was generating. It remained headed toward his tent. Matt began to have panic attacks. It may be an animal, but 2 days before, 2 persons had been at his tent, pilfering his food. He laid there, poised to defend himself should someone approach too closely. He understood, in the middle of nothingness, that someone else was not a buddy. Fearful, he shivered. Matt felt his instincts take hold. Hoping to frighten them away, he sprang out of his sleeping bag, burst outside, and started yelling and wielding a knife. He heard a stick shatter just then straight behind him. He turned to see a black man sprinting at him, and without thinking he fled the encampment. Matt was surrounded in the forest by trees. It was very dark. Driven by adrenaline as he sought to flee someone he thought was pursuing, he was sprinting rapidly, slamming into trees and tumbling to the ground. About 5 minutes of sprinting, he stumbled and dropped near the base of a fallen tree. Matt swiftly went under the log, orienting himself to see back the direction he had come from this tree's landing point, creating a little opening under it. He laid there and noticed a light far off. Searching the jungle were people looking for him. Fearful, he watched as the party carrying the light approached. They passed right past him without looking back. Terrified, Matt hid behind the log all night, even once the sun rose. He stayed there for several hours till early afternoon, at last choosing to crawl out and survey the area. He opted to leave everything behind even though he saw no one close, instead of returning to his campground to pick his gear. He started sprinting once more, back to the trail, too terrified that white people could still be around. Once he arrived on the path, he sprinted all the way to Castella, California. There he hitchhiked to Mount Shasta, not stopping even after he couldn't see them no more. He ran for hours. He continued even as evening fell and the route turned dark. He halted, totally worn out. Only when it was so dark he could not see the ground. Trying to keep as much distance between himself and those folks, he subsequently deserted the trail and headed far into the forest. Finally, he came upon a clearing distant from the path. He erected his tent exactly in the middle and meticulously laid a barrier of sticks around his campground. He climbed into his sleeping bag after zipping himself inside and putting all his gear close in case he had to leave fast. Terrified, he lay there expecting not to sleep. He told himself he had ran several miles ahead of them and reasoned they wouldn't know where he had pitched his tent. He heard sticks breaking around his campfire as he started to nod off. That familiar muttering permeated the air. Then his tent lit up, like though someone was lighting a lamp on him before he could respond. He had been discovered by someone surreptitiously visiting his remote camp. The light went off, and quiet descended, and listened carefully as the footsteps grew nearer until they halted just 1 foot apart from his head. He listened just. He did not see anything. Then he heard whispering, although it appeared to be coming from all around the forest, rather than from straight outside. Uncertain and afraid, Matt lay still. He felt too afraid to wield the knife even though he had it. Everything stopped suddenly. The footsteps and whispering went silent. Though it was a relief, he hoped he could have heard footsteps vanishing into the forest. Rather, it was silence, like if someone else out there still awaited. He couldn't even glimpse outside in the dark to check whether one person or several were standing there. Eventually, daybreak arrived. Matt hadn't heard any footsteps departing either. He knew he had to look outside once the sun was totally up and light entered his tent. He unfastened the flap fast and peeped out to see nothing. Carrying a knife, he left prepared for a conflict, but found no one around. Rather than feeling reassured, he questioned whether someone might be hidden behind the woods. He looked about the campsite for a few minutes, hoping to see those people once more, but came nowhere. He began to doubt himself then. Was that simply a dream? Was it actually as it happened? But down, he found distinct boot tracks all throughout his campground, including a trail encircling his tent. For Matt, this dream had materiality. He hurried back toward the trail after fast packing his belongings and throwing them over his shoulder. He headed north once he arrived on the route, looking over his shoulder all the way. "I just need to get out of Lassen National Forest," he told himself repeatedly. "I had to flee the white folks." That notion drove him to flee this area as fast as he could all day, seeking safety. He emerged from Lassen at last into a neighboring town by the afternoon. Wanting security, he tented near civilization that evening. He considered the last several days as he rested in his tent that evening. He was practically positive that the white folks he had seen on the boulder were orchestrating the unusual nighttime events. Although it made logical that they had pilfers, his meals, the second occurrence from the evening before confused him. Had the white folks been following him all this time, why hadn't he seen? Though he had been staring over his shoulder nonstop, they found him to this unmarked campground deep in the forest. How might they have done that? And what were they up to whispering to each other at his campsite? Why, as they went, did their footsteps and whispers halt without sound? Until he slept off, Matt continued going back over these questions in his head. He woke up the next morning considering the white folks and their wants. He thought of phoning his family to pick him up and departing while he packed his camping. But this climb meant a lot to him, and he was just over 100 miles from completion. He didn't want to stop now after hiking nearly 1,600 miles. He thus packed, tossed his belongings over his shoulder, and carried on. That day, Matt left the small settlement and traveled toward Mount Shasta, another deep forest. Like Lassen, this woodland had a terrible reputation. Many individuals vanish from there under bizarre conditions. Some of the most disturbing tales center on survivors who say they were with someone, turned away for a little period, and then glanced back to find that person had disappeared without a trace, never to be located even after protracted searches. Mount Shasta boasts shockingly high numbers of unexplained vanishings. At set-off into Mount Shasta Forest, keeping that in mind, he pushed through, urging himself to concentrate on finishing his climb, even though the thick trees made him nervous. He lowered his head for the first 3 days and hiked as far as he could every day. Every night he set up camp beside the trail and never ran across anyone, white or otherwise. He was utterly alone. On the 4th day, though, all changed. Matt discovered he was on a broad path down the side of a mountain, where the view was far nicer than surrounded by thick trees. As he went, he savored the lovely day. Then, when he turned around, he saw 2 tiny white dots far back on the path. It was the white folks, backtracking. By now, Matt was more than 50 kilometers distant from the white people he had originally saw seated on a boulder. This verified 2 points. 1, he was correct. They had indeed followed him, and second, they were still behind him for some unidentified reason. Matt suddenly wanted to flee those folks. He had no desire in completing his climb. Rapidly pulling out his map, he was surprised to see he was in one of the most remote sections of the hike, at least 25 miles from Castella, California. In fact, he stored the map, glanced one final time at the white approaching people, and ran down the trail without better choices, and reported his encounter to the Forestry Service and police. They grabbed his details and overnight checked him into a motel. He called his family the following day. They drove from Oregon to fetch him up and head home. Months later, Matt checked in the Mount Shasta Police and the Forest Service to see whether they knew anything about the white folks. Matt was the only one who acknowledged being pursued by the enigmatic couple. The police informed him others had come forward reporting stolen goods from their campsites in Mount Shasta and Lassen Forest. He still doesn't know who they were or what they wanted beyond the meals they consumed. Somehow, they had followed him for almost 100 miles, locating his campsites far off the main trail, all in total darkness. How they accomplished it without waking him still baffles me. Thanks for watching this video. If you enjoyed, please give it a thumbs up and subscribe for more.